38 years, same spot by this water. Everyone's racing to get there first. He never asked if I was sick. He asked, "Do you want to be healed?"
Welcome to Unlock the Word, a new podcast where we study the Bible together and endeavor to unlock new levels of relationship with God through His written word. I'm glad you're here to join us this week.
38 years. That is how long this man has been lying by the pool. Long enough that an entire generation of children had grown up around him, watching him there, day after day, year after year, lying on his mat near the water, waiting for something that never came. Long enough that the regulars at the pool, the other sick and disabled people who gathered there every day, had probably even stopped noticing him as anything unusual. He was simply part of the landscape of that place. The way a stone or a column becomes part of the landscape after enough years passed. There was a belief in that place that the water in this particular pool would occasionally stir, and whoever managed to get into the water first, the instant it stirred, would be healed of whatever afflicted them. So people came. Crowds of the sick and disabled gathered at the edges of this pool day after day, watching the surface of the water with the kind of intense practice attention you only develop after waiting a very long time for something. Competing with one another, sometimes desperately, for the chance to be the first when the water finally moved. 38 years of watching other people get there first. 38 years of being too slow, too weak, too unsupported, too alone to win the race to the water's edge. And Jesus walks up to this man. Not the loudest one in the crowd, not the most visibly desperate one, simply this one. Out of what John tells us was a great multitude of sick people gathered at that pool. And he asks him a question that sounds on the surface almost strange, almost unnecessary, and even slightly insulting given the circumstances. Do you want to be healed? Of course he wants to be healed. Why else would he be lying by this pool for 38 years? And yet Jesus asks the question anyway, directly to a man whose answer is about to reveal something important about what 38 years of disappointment can quietly do to a person's hope, even when that hope appears from the outside to still be fully intact. And underneath the healing itself, we're going to find one of the boldest theological claims Jesus makes anywhere in the gospel. A claim about his own identity so direct that it will move the religious leadership of that day from mere suspicion into an active plot to kill him. Welcome back to Unlock the Word, a Real Talk Deep Devotion podcast. I'm Matthew Harvey, and this is episode 9. We are here in the chapter 5 of John. Today we're going to focus on the first 18 verses, the healing at the pool of Bethesda, and the controversy it ignites within the religious authorities in Jerusalem. But to appreciate the weight of what is about to happen here in Jerusalem, we have to remember where we've been. We've traced the Logos becoming flesh, full of grace and truth. We have watched the calling of the first disciples, the wine kept until now at the Cana wedding, the temple cleared of its commerce, Nicodemus learning that he must be born ano then, from above, by pneuma, wind and spirit, moving where it wills. We watched the woman at the well discover that true worship has nothing to do with the right mountain or the right address for a temple, but everything to do with spirit and in truth. And just last episode, we watched a royal official believe a single rhema, a single spoken word sent across 20 miles of distance, and walk home to find his son already healed at the very hour the word was spoken. Today, we're going to move into genuinely new territory. The first direct, public, sustained conflict between Jesus and the religious authorities of Jerusalem over what is permitted on the Sabbath. And underneath that very real conflict, there's a much deeper, much more personal question being asked of one specific man, and through him, of every single one of us. So we're also going to spend some real time today with the church's oldest reflection on what it means that healing in this gospel is never merely a physical repair. It's always a small window into the larger restoration that the early church theologians and spiritual guides describe as the true aim of salvation. So let's jump in and read John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now the day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, the man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Okay, there's a lot to break down here, so let's jump right into these first few verses. After this, there was a feast of Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool in Hebrew called Bethsaida, a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Now, the name of this pool is worth sitting with for a moment, because it carries an irony. John almost certainly understands and intends for us to notice here. It literally means house of mercy or house of grace, from the word beit, meaning house, and chest, one of the richest and most theologically loaded words in the entire Hebrew Bible. A covenant loyalty and loving kindness that goes far beyond what is technically owed or strictly deserved. This is the word used throughout the Psalms to describe God's steadfast, unwavering love toward his covenant people. This was the name given to this particular place, the house of mercy. And yet, for the man we're about to meet, this house of mercy had been, for 38 consecutive years, a house of repeated, grinding disappointment. The very name of the place promised something the place itself had never once actually delivered to this man, no matter how faithfully or how long he showed up and waited. John tells us a great multitude of invalids lay there continuously. And then he explains what that means. Blind, lame, paralyzed, every kind of physical affliction represented. All of them waiting day after day for the water to stir. Now, archaeological excavations conducted in Jerusalem in more recent history have actually confirmed the existence of a pool matching this exact description, complete with 5 covered colonnades, precisely as the Apostle John here describes in this passage. And I want to pause on that detail because I think it matters more than it might seem. John is writing as someone with real, specific, verifiable, on-the-ground knowledge of the actual geography of Jerusalem. He's not crafting a symbolic parable or a piece of theological friction, but rather reporting carefully on an actual physical place that he or his immediate source had genuinely seen with their own eyes. And among this entire multitude of suffering people, one man in particular catches Jesus' attention. Out of what must have been dozens or possibly even hundreds of people gathered at the water's edge that day. It says, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. 38 years. Now, for context, that's longer than most people in the ancient world even lived at all. Long enough to become quite literally part of the permanent landscape of that place. Recognized by name, perhaps, but no longer noticed as anything remarkable. Long enough that hope, if it had ever burned brightly and urgently in this man's heart, had almost certainly worn down, slowly and gradually, into something closer to just routine habit, the daily exhausting cycle of being carried to the pool each morning, watching the water with whatever attention he could still muster, watching other people, faster or better supported than himself, get there first, and then being carried home again each evening, year after year after year, without any meaningful change. Now, it's worth noting this also what this man did not have, which every other person gathered at the pool apparently did have in some measure. Family, friends, or even hired help who were willing to carry him to the water's edge quickly enough to win the race when it mattered. 38 years is long enough for whatever support network he once had to have exhausted itself, drifted away, or even simply died. He is, in every visible sense, alone in that crowd, surrounded by people and utterly isolated within the same crowd at the same time. And here's where we pick up in verses 6 and 7. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been an invalid for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus saw him. Now, it's the same word, again, the very seeing we have carefully tracked since the very first chapter of this gospel. The seeing that knows fully, that perceives completely, that is never casual or accidental. And John adds something quite specific here that he didn't need to include. Jesus knew that this man had been an invalid for a long time. This was not a random chance encounter in a crowded place. Jesus possessed specific, accurate knowledge of this particular man's specific history before a single word had even passed between them. And then comes the question, do you want to be healed? Now, to understand the profound psychological and spiritual depth of this question, we have to look at the Greek verb behind want. The Greek word is thelo. Thelo means to will, to wish, or to actively desire. It's a verb describing genuine active volition. It's not merely a vague or passive preference. Jesus is not asking a throwaway question here, the kind of thing you might say to fill an awkward silence. He's asking with real precision whether this particular man's deepest will, his actual desire at the very center of his being, is genuinely oriented towards wholeness. Well, this turns out to be a far more probing, far more searching question than it first appears to be. Because 38 years of accumulated disappointment can do something subtle, slow, and quietly corrosive to a person's desire over time. Identity itself can gradually reorganize around a condition that was originally only meant to be temporary. The pool, the daily routine of being carried there, the established rhythm of waiting and failing and waiting again after 38 years, all of this had become, in some very real sense, this man's entire life and his entire identity. Healing would not simply remove a physical limitation, it would require almost overnight an entirely new way of existing in the world. New responsibilities, new expectations from his community. No remaining built-in excuse for anything. And notice carefully the man's actual answer to this direct question. He does not say yes. He does not say no either. He explains instead why he hasn't been healed yet. I have no one to put me in the pool while I'm going another steps down before me. This is the worn, practiced language of 38 years of consistently being beaten to the water by someone faster, someone stronger, someone with more help available. And there's a real legitimate pathos in this answer, right? I don't want to flatten it into a simple moralizing lesson about lack of faith on this man's part. His circumstances really were exactly as difficult as he describes them. And if we're being honest, his frustration was entirely justified by 38 years of lived experience. But notice also that his entire answer is fundamentally about his external circumstances, not his internal desire. Jesus asked him what he wanted at the deepest level. The man answered understandably with a detailed explanation of his obstacles. But sometimes the most honest, most truthful answer any of us can give to the question, do you want to be healed, is not a clean yes or a clean no, but rather a long list of all the reasons it hasn't happened yet. And Jesus remarkably, generously does not require this man to first resolve his own internal ambivalence or to articulate some perfectly clear and confident desire before he's willing to act on his behalf. Jesus responds in verses 8 and 9. He says, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. There's no discussion whatsoever of this man's merit or worthiness. No requirement that he first articulate sufficiently confident faith before anything happens. There's not even an instruction to get into the pool's water at all, which is genuinely striking, given that specific water, that getting into that specific water was the entire premise behind why this man and everyone else gathered around him had been waiting at this exact pool for years, sometimes decades. Jesus bypasses the entire elaborate system this man had organized his hope around for nearly 4 decades and simply speaks 3 short commands. Get up, take up your bed, and walk. 3 commands, and the man obeys all 3 of them instantly and is healed in that very same instant. This is the very same pattern we carefully traced together in episode 8 with the official son. A word is spoken and healing is accomplished with no intervening ritual, no required process, no necessary waiting period of any kind. The spoken word carries its own complete and sufficient power, entirely independent of water, independent of timing, independent of the entire elaborate competitive system this pool had organized around itself for who knows how many years before this particular morning. Take up your bed. Now, this particular detail matters more than it might initially seem to. Jesus does not simply heal this man and then walk away, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. He specifically instructs him to pick up the very mat he had been lying on for 38 consecutive years and carry it himself under his own power. The physical object that had quietly come to define his entire existence, right? The thing he was carried in on each day, the visible marker that identified him publicly as one of the sick lying by the pool, becomes in a single instant something he now carries himself, rather than something that has been carrying him for nearly 4 decades. The old symbol of his former identity is not simply discarded or thrown aside. It's repurposed, carried now under his own strength as living, visible evidence of exactly what has changed him. But there's a problem with this, and we see it here in verses 9 through 13, where it says, "Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.'" Verses 9 and 10. The entire tone of the passage shifts immediately. John has been carefully building a quiet, intimate, deeply human story about one specific man's healing after decades of accumulated disappointment. And now the religious authorities stepped in abruptly and they've taken over. Their very first immediate concern is not the healing itself. It's not the restored life of a man who had suffered. It's the technical, legal violation of Sabbath regulations involved in the simple act of carrying a sleeping mat. Now, to understand why this mattered so intensely to them, you have to understand just how seriously the Sabbath was held within first century Jewish religious life. The Sabbath command, rooted directly in the 4th of the 10 Commandments and in the creation account itself, right? God rested on the 7th day, and so his covenant people were commanded to rest as well. And this was considered one of the single most fundamental, identity-defining markers of Jewish covenant faithfulness, distinguishing Israel from every other surrounding nation. Now, over the course of many centuries, legal scholars had developed an extensive, highly detailed body of interpretation defining with with great precision exactly what did and did not constitute quote-unquote forbidden work on the Sabbath day. Carrying virtually any kind of burden, including something as simple as a sleeping mat, fell squarely within those prohibited categories under that tradition. The man, still apparently entirely unaware of who had actually healed him, simply explains the situation as plainly and honestly as he can. The man who healed me said to me, "Take up your bed and walk." He's not attempting to defend some carefully reasoned theological position about Sabbath law. He's simply reporting very plainly and without embellishment exactly what happened to the authorities who are now demanding an explanation. And then John tells us something that I think is significantly important. The man did not yet know who Jesus actually was, because Jesus had already withdrawn discreetly into the surrounding crowd immediately after healing him. There was no fanfare whatsoever, no public claiming of credit, no demand for recognition or gratitude on Jesus' part. The healing itself, given freely and then left to stand entirely on its own, seemed to be the complete message that Jesus wanted to deliver in that particular moment. But he doesn't stop there, right? Because here in verse 14 we pick up where it says, "Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.'" So Jesus deliberately seeks this man out a second time and finds him in the very same temple courts that we encountered back earlier in the gospel. And this time gives him a word of caution and instruction alongside the joyful confirmation of his healing. "Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Now, I want to be genuinely careful here, because this particular verse has, throughout church history, sometimes come across and been misread in a way that suggests this man's 38 years of illness were a direct, specific punishment for some particular sin that he had committed. A reading Jesus explicitly and directly rejects elsewhere in this very gospel, most clearly in chapter 9, when his own disciples ask whether a different man's blindness from birth was caused by his own sin or by his parents' sin. And in that account, Jesus plainly says neither one. I don't believe that simplistic reading is what is happening here either. I believe Jesus is doing something subtly different and far more caring and pastoral. He's using this specific moment of restored physical wholeness as an opportunity to point this man toward an even deeper, more comprehensive kind of restoration. Not merely the healing of his body after 38 years, remarkable as that already is, but the ongoing wholeness and integrity of his entire remaining life. Physical healing alone, however dramatic and welcome, does not automatically guarantee that a person's whole life is now oriented towards what is good for them. And so Jesus, in effect, is saying, you have just been given your body back after decades of waiting. Now, going forward, live in a way that honors and reflects the magnitude of the gift you have just received. We pick up here in verse 15 where it says, "The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath." That's verses 15 and 16. So So now, before the guy goes, I don't even know who this guy is, but now the man identifies Jesus by name to the religious authorities, and the conflict that has been steadily building throughout this entire passage finally breaks fully and publicly into the open. The religious leaders begin actively persecuting Jesus, specifically because of this particular Sabbath day healing. And what Jesus says in direct response to their resulting accusation is one of the single most loaded statements in the entire gospel up to this point. He says, "My Father is working still, and I am working." Whew. Now, this one compact sentence accomplishes two genuinely enormous things simultaneously. And the religious leaders heard both of them with immediate clarity. First, it directly and pointedly claims the Father's ongoing continuous activity in the world, which is a quiet but unmistakably pointed rejection of the rigid Sabbath theology that had developed in certain circles of Jewish religious thought. The idea that God himself had ceased all activity whatsoever on the seventh day in some absolute, unqualified sense. Jesus argues, in effect, with devastating logical simplicity, if my Father continues every single day without exception to sustain the entire universe, to give breath and life to every living creature, to hold the whole of creation together moment by moment, because creation itself does not simply pause or go on hold merely because a particular day has been formally marked as holy and set apart, then his Son can certainly, by the same logic, continue the work of healing on the Sabbath day without any contradiction. That's number one. And number two, this is the part that truly enrages the assembled religious leaders far more than the Sabbath technically itself. Jesus calls God my Father in a context where the personal, intimate, exclusive claim of unique sonship is completely unmistakable to anyone listening. As a matter of fact, John tells us directly and explicitly, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. These guys understood exactly what he was claiming about himself. This was not some unfortunate misunderstanding on their part. They heard the claim correctly, accurately, and completely. And they found it absolutely intolerable. A claim worthy of death by their own legal standards. Remember the prologue all the way back in episode 1? The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Remember the temple in episode 4? Called explicitly his Father's oikos? Every single thread we have carefully traced since chapter 1 of this gospel converges directly here in this moment. In this one sentence spoken openly in public defense of healing a man who had simply waited 38 long years for someone to finally help him into the water. It's worth returning before we close to that opening question. Do you want to be healed? Because it carries more theological weight than a quick reading allows. This is where the early church's deep understanding of salvation becomes especially clear. If Jesus were only interested in fixing broken bodies, the question he asked would be unnecessary. He already knew what he was about to do, regardless of this man's answer. But the question matters because the whole man matters. Not just the legs, but the will, the desire, the 38 years of learned resignation that had quietly reshaped what this man believed was possible for his own life. So this is the pattern of soteriology. Soteriology is the study of salvation. What we've been talking about, saved for, not just saved from. Not simply saved from paralysis, but restored to a full human life, walking, working, worshiping in the temple where Jesus finds him afterward. Capable of being addressed with a moral charge of sin no more. That assumes he is now a whole agent again, not merely a healed body. But this is a pattern in salvation of purification, illumination, and union. And if we look closely, we can see this exact divine pattern mapping directly onto the paralyzed man's encounter with Christ. We see purification, or catharsis. This man begins with the honest, painful naming of reality. Jesus confronts the man's 38 years of resignation, forcing him to look past his habitual excuses and face the raw state of his soul and body. Illumination, or theoria, is the sudden and direct and life-giving encounter with the uncreated light of God. It is the exact moment when the rhema is spoken, and at once the man was healed. He's illuminated, his body and mind instantly reordered by the presence of the Logos. And then we see union, or theosis. This is the ultimate goal: ongoing communion and a shared life with God. This is represented by Jesus deliberately seeking him out a second time in the temple. Jesus does not abandon him to figure out his new life alone. He seeks him out to establish a lasting relationship, guiding his steps into a completely new way of being. All right, now I know we've covered a lot, but let's bring it all the way home. A man laying by a pool called the House of Mercy for 38 years, watching other people repeatedly receive what he never could reach in time, until the day Jesus finally asked him a question that cut straight to the very center of his own heart. Do you actually want to be healed? Not merely your circumstances, not merely the long list of obstacles you have grown so accustomed to, but the will itself underneath all of it. And then, without requiring the man to first resolve his own ambivalence or to articulate some perfectly clean and confident yes, Jesus simply spoke a rhema. Get up, take up your bed, and walk. And the man was instantly, completely, totally healed. After 38 years. 38 years of waiting did not disqualify him. The lack of anyone to help him into the water did not disqualify him. His own confused circumstances, focused answer to piercingly direct question did not disqualify him either. And the controversy that immediately follows this healing reveals something the religious authorities understood with perfect, painful clarity, even as they categorically rejected it. That the one performing this healing was openly claiming to be doing nothing less than his own Father's ongoing, continuous work in the world. He's not claiming to be a prophet temporarily borrowing some measure of divine power for a single afternoon. The Son doing precisely what his Father does is exactly the way the Father does it. Because he is, in the deepest and fullest sense, exactly who the Father is. And that is the gospel message in John chapter 5. A piercing question that finds the genuine will hiding beneath a long list of practiced excuses. A spoken word that heals completely without requiring any ritual at all. And a claim about his own identity that Jesus will not soften or retract, no matter how much it ultimately costs him. And there's a few questions I want you to carry with you this week. What version of the I have no one to help me have you been offering God when what he actually asked was whether you want to be whole? Naming an obstacle, honestly, is not the same thing as answering the deeper question of desire underneath it. Is there a mat that you're still carrying that used to carry you? An old identity built around a limitation, a season of waiting, or a story about yourself that no longer matches what God has already done? What would it look like to pick that mat up and carry it rather than to let it continue to define where you lie down each day? And finally, where might Jesus be seeking you out the second time, the way he sought this man out? Not to condemn what has already been healed, but to point you toward the next layer of wholeness that he wants for your life, not just the part that was most visibly broken. I want to thank you for joining me today. If this episode connected with you, I want to encourage you to share it. Send it to someone who has been waiting so long for change that they've quietly stopped being sure they even want it anymore. And if you think about it, leave a review on Spotify or YouTube because it genuinely helps other people find their way to this table. New episodes of Unlock the Word are available every single week. And in the next one, we are staying right here in this very same scene because Jesus is about to respond to the accusation that he is making himself equal with God, with one of the longest, richest, most theologically dense, and carefully constructed defenses of his own identity anywhere in the entire gospel. You won't want to miss it. But until then, stay in the Word, stay in the Word.